All right, let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome at this global session where we're going to talk about how to build strong, inclusive and equitable innovation ecosystems in cities throughout the world. My name is Lara van Beckham. I'm actually taking over quite last minute from Anushka, who wasn't able to make it to the session. So I'm going to moderate this session on behalf of her today to the best of my abilities. But I'm sure we'll be fine because we have three amazing speakers lined up for today. We have Julie Wagner here with us. She's the president of the Global Innovation Institute and Innovation Districts. We have Tim Rowe here, the founder and the CEO of CIC, also known as the Cambridge Innovation Center, as well as Venture Café Global Institute and CIC Health. And we have Christine Wergeland-Sorby with us. She is the CEO of Oslo Science City. So really great that you all are here today for this international panel. And of course, a big welcome to everyone who joined us today. We're going to kick off with some short introductions by the speakers themselves. But if you have any questions intermediately, just please raise your virtual hand so we can give the floor to you, or feel free, of course, to enter your questions into the chat. Me and my colleague Daniel will be taking care of the chat, and we will be reading through your questions and of course posing them on your behalf to the speakers. Yeah, let's start. And I'd love to start with Julie. Could you share a little bit about yourself, and then we'll kick off about the session and the first questions that we have in store.
Sure. So I'm Julie Wagner. I am the president of the Global Institute on Innovation Districts. It's a recently formed not-for-profit. It's 2 years old. We basically conduct independent research on the growth and evolution of innovation districts, but we also have a network, and then we're working on the ground in a number of places to help advance the practice. And then just lastly, the work that we're doing importantly builds on the work and the research that I and others led at the Brookings Institute.
All right, thank you. Christine, do you want to share something about you?
I think you're on mute.
Oh, Christine, you're on mute, yeah.
Of course. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Wergeland-Sorby, and I'm the CEO of Oslo Science City, the first innovation district in Norway. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to a very interesting session.
Thank you, Christine. Tim?
Hi, everybody. I know a bunch of you, familiar faces. I'm Tim Rowe. I'm the founder and CEO of CIC and also the founder of Venture Café Global Network. And really excited to be here and share some thoughts about how this exciting area is evolving during and post-pandemic.
All right, thank you all. Yeah, and let's delve into that subject. I mean, you all are closely related to innovation districts and have a lot of knowledge and expertise into the field. So let's start with Julie. Can you share something about what your vision is on the value of innovation districts, and also what the effect is of a changing reality now we're in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis?
Boy, we really are. And someday we're all going to be together. So I first, actually, what I'd like to do is just, because I'm not sure who's on, I just want to give a really simple definition of an innovation district so we're sort of clear what it is and what it isn't. So an innovation district is basically the antithesis of a monoculture, industrial, or research park. They combine research institutions, corporate, startups, scale-ups, a whole sort of line of entrepreneurial support organizations, intermediaries, and they're really in like these really mixed up, mash up places that have density and proximity, and they value creativity, and there's all this sort of different things going on, and there's lots of different types of people that are throwing and creating and collaborating and aiming to commercialize. And so when we go out and we conduct research in these places and we go on the ground and we look at the numbers, we are continuously reminded on how different these places are. They are so distinctive. They're so different, which makes them so interesting and powerful as a researcher to look at, and from those diverse sort of viewpoints and strengths, how they're producing really different kinds of outcomes. Now, what's binding them is really what they value. They value quality places. They value physical proximity, where concentrations of people and researchers and infrastructure come together. And there's a lot of work around that, about how you create this kind of proximity. And then there's this piece around a value of deep connections between people. So a lot of the programming and the training and the mentoring and the support, which really, to me, this is what keeps me in this space, is really understanding that and the work there. So the values that I just sort of talked about are really a value proposition, if you will. And it's a powerful one: place and proximity and face-to-face communication and interaction. And then the pandemic hit, and what we found was people being forced to sort of collapse back into their homes and make offices. And then those places that are really connected places where people would meet were closed, and some closed permanently. And so painfully, right, this connective tissue in our society just sort of felt like it just erased. And so here we are working in our homes, trying to wrestle work and home life, which, you know, for me as a mother with 2 kids is not an easy thing to do. And I'm sure this is how a lot of people have been challenged. And so you have then these values of place and physical proximity and face-to-face, and then you start seeing these companies that are coming out with these new policies around remote work and how this is going to continue, because we're also productive, seemingly productive in our own homes. And so, wow, this is raising new questions. And as a researcher, it's raising a lot of new questions around what is the future of innovation districts that are valuing place and people and proximity and face-to-face. And so for us, it was in no way a moment of crisis. It was really a moment of let's learn, let's research, let's understand, right? So some of those, I want to walk through some of those insights in particular, because one of the things that we did in 2020 in the height of the pandemic is with 9 innovation districts, we went really deep. We conducted deep empirical analysis on 9 in 6 countries, really different economic starting points, different R&D strengths, to really understand what makes them powerful. And after hundreds of pages of analysis, you know, we definitely see that consistently they are locales of significant R&D funding and spending, significant areas of where there's a tremendous amount of research and innovation infrastructure of researchers, and all these sort of ancillary effects of the labs and all the different small and medium enterprises and the startups that are coming as a result, this sort of strong co-location piece. So this was really interesting. And then we found on top of that some of them had a surprisingly high percentage of their country's competitive grant funding, which is a signal, okay, which says research excellence, ability to solve some of the really tough challenges of our time. Well, aren't we in a tough challenge of our time right now? So it sort of dovetails right then with this other research, and I'm going to show a slide if I can manage to do this, that basically says, okay, we reached out then to a series of innovation districts to say, what are you working on? Are you stepping back given the pandemic? Or are you leaning in? And so here is an example in April 2020, where we found a number of innovation districts that had that level of R&D sophistication, that had the kind of networks, that had the infrastructure to really be leaning in to focus on viral and other solutions for COVID-19. And we started to follow that and dovetail that for quite some time. And we really found, my gosh, these really are places on the front lines of change that are trying to address some of these intractable problems. And of course, infectious diseases is just one of those, right? So here's another way, right, that we were starting to understand the power of districts. Separate analysis, this is not the 9, but this one is in Haifa in Israel. And here we were starting to try to understand what is importantly powering these districts so distinctively. And here is an emerging district, a range of different actors in the downtown and the waterfront. And in that geography, here's what we surfaced. We surfaced these really interesting connections being made through advanced technologies, AI, robotics, machine learning, importantly, fueling the new thinking on a whole range of sectors. And a whole range of sectors where you had large companies and small startups sort of valuing these advanced technologies to move and accelerate their thinking. So these are the only 2 slides that I'm going to show, but basically sort of signal, right, it's this interesting set of strengths that uniquely position them to be highly problem solvers of our time, like significant problem solvers of our time, and also most likely quite resilient to this remote work phenomenon because a lot of the infrastructure is located in place. So my last remark, and then I'm going to turn this over to Tim, who's going to really go deeper on some of this. One of the last things that I really wanted to make an observation on as we reached out to probably 50 to 60 districts and understanding what are they doing, the power of the networks, the power of all the connections that had been made between people and firms because they had been established so beautifully beforehand, right? We're able to just be transitioned to online and all these sort of creative ways. And I know Venture Cafes, I've been watching what you've been doing, I've been participating, and you do it so beautifully of sort of that transition and keeping people connected. And so this is another fundamental value proposition of these places, these kind of actors like yourself creating these connections. Tim, I'm going to turn it to you.
Oh, thank you, Julie. And that was a great framing of this topic area. And I think what we're all seeing in terms of the evolution of these districts, Julie and I and the other speakers had a chance to kind of have a little preamble discussion. And I shared a little data about what we're actually seeing in this space. And people said, hey, could you share that here? So I will do that in a minute. I want to underscore what you said about connecting connecting people and connecting across the districts. Just looking at the chat, I saw hellos from Sydney, Australia, from Warsaw, from Mexico, from Miami, of course, from Massachusetts, Toronto, Los Angeles, Ontario, Rotterdam, Oslo. I think, did I say that twice? Phoenix, San Francisco. So it's really great to see the breadth of this brain trust here that's come together. I think knowing some of the names here, and I think there's a Montreal in there too, perhaps. Knowing some of the names here, I know that many of you are involved in leading and growing innovation districts, and so I hope we can think of this as a kind of a roundtable and to hear from you, your thoughts and your learnings, not just the speakers. So I think one of the big questions that people have that Julie teed up are, is there some sort of watershed moment where, suddenly the world's going to look radically different, after the pandemic from what it did look like before? And I think the answer is mostly no, with a little bit of yes. And I'll try to give some data around that. Generally, people tend to overestimate the amount of change that's going to happen in a short period of time, and they underestimate the amount of change that's going to happen in a long period of time. And so yes, the world is changing, but next year probably we won't be a lot different than last year. And let me just share some data that goes to that. Hopefully there's not anything too terribly embarrassing on my screen here if I got the wrong one. I don't even see the right one coming up, so give me another second here. Here we go. Trying one more time. Yep. That image, by the way, is just one of the venture cafes. This is the one in St. Louis, Missouri. And this is pre-pandemic, as you can tell from the people. The first is just, kind of real estate itself. This is like a little bit of a the behind innovation districts, what's happening with that. I found good data from Europe. This is from the 27 countries of Europe. I don't have it from the US, but I think it's going to be pretty similar based on what we're seeing. This is construction starts over time. They follow a pretty predictable cyclic pattern. You then see this brief period of time at the beginning of the pandemic where suddenly, everything stopped. People said, oh my gosh, are we, has the world changed? Do we even need buildings anymore? And then what you see in the most recent data is like, oh, no, yeah, actually it's fine. And so I just thought you might find that interesting insight. That this is what investors believe when they're putting, dollars down. It's not exactly the same as what end users believe. And so then the next interesting question is sort of what can we say about end user behavior? How are end users thinking about whether they're likely to be in these kinds of spaces or not? And how are they voting with their feet? If you extend this data and you say, okay, let's just believe for the moment that this is true, that this is kind of how people look at it, then yes, innovation districts are going to be very healthy, very strong. We are hearing a growing sense that simply being in an office where it doesn't give you some other value of interaction with colleagues and so forth, that there's less interest in that. More companies are reluctant to renew long-term leases for, say, a traditional office building in the suburbs. There is a bit of a question about whether companies will simply have more people work remotely more of the time rather than grow their physical footprints in traditional office space. And so our gut is that the cores, those innovation districts that offer something more than office space, will be healthy and will grow and may grow dramatically as more companies say, hey, maybe I want something more flexible. Maybe I want something where my people are kind of remote when they want to be remote, and they're with interesting people that can give them, inspiration and support and learning when they're not remote. And many of these innovation districts are also structurally more flexible, where there's spaces like ours that are not, kind of a locked in 5 or 10 year lease. There's something, kind of shorter term and more dynamic. I certainly know that's the case, Christine, in your space in Oslo. And I think generally we see that around the country and around the world. So our take right now is that innovation districts are going to be very healthy, are going to grow, and that there will, however, be a stronger component of people partially working remotely or some of the time working remotely, joining companies from farther afield, so that you may have an employee who is in Africa or somewhere else that is beaming in while other employees are local and on site. And we are starting to think about how the workplace needs to change to respond to that. But those are, I guess, my opening comments.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Tim. It's remarkable to see the resilience of the innovation districts and some of the facts you shared there. And also happy to hear that you conclude that these innovation districts will continue to be healthy. And thanks for the compliments, Julie, on behalf of, I think, the Venture Café network across the globe. Yeah, it makes me curious to hear more about Oslo as well, Christine. So can you share something about how how COVID has altered the long-term plans in Oslo when it comes to building an innovation ecosystem there?
Thank you, Laura. First of all, it's so interesting to listen to Julie and Tim, and it's really relevant for us in Oslo. And I'm really looking forward to share a bit around what we are working on in Oslo. So as I mentioned, Oslo Science City is the first innovation district in Norway. And Norway has been among the countries in Europe least affected by COVID-19. Even so, we have learned 3 important lessons relevant for our discussion today. And first of all, the importance of digital skills in the population in public sector and in business. Second, the need for flexibility and agility to adjust to changing circumstances. And at last but not least, this reminds us that health and life sciences is important not only to create value and new jobs, but also to ensure the resilience of our societies and the well-being of our citizens. So the focus for us in Oslo is to build strong ecosystem in the fields where we already have a unique advantage. And by doing this, we can drive innovation and create thousands of new jobs. So Oslo Science City is strategically situated in the most knowledge-intensive area in Norway. We have the University of Oslo and the University Hospital as our two anchor institutions. We also house a science park, a leading research institutes, and a growing number of startups in many different sectors. In total, Oslo Science City has 300 startups and scale-ups, 7,500 researchers, and 30,000 students. We have world-leading research groups in health and life sciences, clean technologies, and digital innovation. So COVID-19 has really highlighted the importance of innovation at all levels in our country. As well as investing in the innovation community, we need to develop environments where students, researchers, and business come together and collaboration happens in new ways. We feel confident that people we want to meet and work together, also physically, after COVID-19. So, however, we focus a lot of flexibility when we now plan for new startup hubs, space for collaboration, workspaces for businesses, and student facilities.
Great, also promising words from the Oslo side. And perhaps, Christine, can you share a little bit more about the city of Oslo and provide us with some highlights to kind of better understand the environment in which you work?
Yes, I'd love to. We are one of the fastest growing cities in Europe. Oslo is compact in every sense, with short distances between basically everything. It takes 20 minutes on the subway from the city center to the forest, where you can hike and go skiing. Norway is a high trust society, and this is a huge advantage when doing business and facilitates seamless collaboration through the ecosystem. Oslo was awarded a European Green Capital in 2019, and the city is a leader on cutting carbon emissions and is introducing electric transportation faster than any other city I know. Historically, Oslo had a strong shipbuilding cluster and a lot of heavy industries. Today, the city has transformed into a competitive and diversified service economy. Norway is one of the most digitized economies in the world. And as the capital of Norway, Norway has developed strong positions in digital services and innovation. So wherever you go, wherever you do in Oslo, payments are digital. Coming to Oslo, you better learn the term WIPS. It's the easiest way to transfer money, and it's developed in Oslo. We also have one of the youngest populations in Europe with a highly educated and skilled workforce. Oslo has over 15 higher education institutions with more than 80,000 students. And access to the education is free of charge. In the last 10 years, the startup community in Oslo has grown fast. We are now at the point where we have established a solid foundation for companies such as Kahoot!, Spacemaker, Algeta, and Vexibody to grow and thrive internationally.
Wonderful. That's some great names and facts and figures you have there. And if you look at the future, Christine, what do you think? What is your insight into the future plan of Oslo and the innovation district there?
As I said, Norway, Oslo Science City is the most knowledge intensive area in Norway, and that is a good starting point. And currently there are plans for investing more than 5 billion euros in new hospital facilities, a new life science center, new workspaces for the research institutes, networking facilities, and urban qualities. And we are now in the middle of our feasibility study with A-Lab from Norway and BIG from Denmark as our core advisors. And we want to transform a sleepy part of Oslo into an innovative, vibrant, inclusive, and sustainable area. And for Oslo and Norway, an innovation district is especially important as a way to diversify our economy away from oil and gas and stimulate innovation and green growth. We want to increase the number of successful startups and scale-ups significantly. We are also inviting leading companies, both national and international, to locate key activities to Oslo Science City. And Julie, as you said in one of your reports, we want to provide a strong foundation for the creation of firms and jobs by helping companies, entrepreneurs, researchers, and investors to co-invent and co-produce new discoveries for the market. And you know, we are confident that this would be good for Oslo and if important for Norway.
All right, thank you for sharing that, Christine.
Thank you.
And I'd love to get the views of Tim and Julie as well on this. So what is your vision on 2022, I should say, and beyond when it comes to the innovation districts?
Julie, do you want to start?
So, yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that has really impressed us in our research, and we're seeing this more and more, is, you know, this pandemic has really pushed the need for real sort of challenge-oriented, mission-oriented research. So it's rather than all these sort of discrete fields doing independent research, sort of organizing around a particular challenge or mission. So while you were talking, Christina, I was starting to quickly look at, like, you know, what are all the different kinds of disciplines that are starting to come together in some of these districts. And a lot of the ones that we're looking at that are particularly strong in biomedical and health sciences are in fact the ones that are organizing around infectious diseases, around these sort of pandemic related challenges, and investments are sort of also sort of flowing in. So I think this is going to have a tremendous ripple effect. And I think this is an important vision to actually also convey. We have tremendous challenges confronting our societies, from climate change to cancer. So organizing these districts, clarity on their strengths and how they're organizing to solve some of these challenges in a really intentional way. I think this is the future for a number of these districts, and one that we would absolutely support.
Just to add from our perspective, you know, we are actively out looking for new sites. Our new sites in Warsaw and Tokyo are growing quickly, even despite the pandemic. There's no slowing down. You know, we're out there publicly saying that our vision is to build an innovation center, a large, capable innovation center similar to those that we have now in each of the major innovation cities around the world, and that's about 50 cities. The only new thing that we're really adding to that recently is more driven not by the pandemic, but by an increased focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're starting to ask ourselves what other cities in the world we should be going to in order to have a global network which is more inclusive of all the people around the world. I was in Africa last week. I actually looked at some sites, don't have anything yet, but that's a direction that I think that you'll see us go over the next decade.
That's excellent. Can I add one point too, just building off of what you said, Tim? That's another vision without question. So I was sort of talking about, okay, here's some major societal problems. We have another one, right? Which is, and you talked about it, Tim, is sort of dramatic levels of inequity and inequality. And we can see how districts have, you know, if you look at the constitution of who's working there and who's innovating, that we have some work to do still. And so what I've started to see, and many years have already been doing it, but a real, like a greater focus on figuring out how do we have women and minorities basically at the front end of the spear, driving innovation, driving R&D, being in more than sort of mid to low level, but management and leaders, CEOs and down, and for leading on R&D and leading in entrepreneurialism. And so we're seeing a series of intermediaries focusing on how do you get more women and minorities to be in these very particular positions. I think this is an important piece for districts without question.
I think these are the right questions to be asking. I was just looking at the chat stream and some of the questions that have come in. I think this question of equitable access, economic development, getting more public support, these sorts of questions have come up. So I might just speak briefly to those. In terms of economic development, I think this is why innovation districts have generally been supported pretty extensively by public sector. Another way to look at that question is, other than building an innovation district, what could you possibly do to improve your economic development situation? I mean, it's almost turning it around. The classically, and I don't envy the folks that are in roles of secretaries of economic development or ministers of economic development for states and countries. You know, the classic thing other than this was to sort of give money to international organizations coming to tax breaks and things. And there's mixed reviews on, well, you know, how well that strategy works. The notion of focusing on innovation is pretty straightforward. The businesses that tend to sustain a country tend to have come from that country. The businesses that you see growing and thriving around the world have deep local links. And so if you're to have any such businesses in the future, you have to build them. You have to grow them from scratch. There is a natural process by which existing companies die. I think the average lifespan of existing companies, there was an interesting chart I saw recently about how the lifespan of existing companies is declining. So it used to be that your typical corporation lived like 70 or 80 years. I think now they live like 50 or 45 years or something like that. But basically any company that used to be the mainstay of your community, town, et cetera, if you were, you know, Rochester, New York, and you had Kodak, you know, these days you've got 45 years. And then Kodak's going to go away and be replaced by something else. But when it's replaced, it's not necessarily replaced in Rochester. So what you need to do is be thinking, how am I, you know, wherever I am in the world, how am I going to be birthing the next round of Kodaks, if you will, for the new generation? And the notion of an innovation district is just to ease that process a little bit for folks that have those ideas, give them role models. We're working a lot in Japan right now, in Tokyo, which is a very successful economy in many ways, but is not seen as an innovation or startup economy these days. The Japanese companies that are successful are ones that we're all familiar with, the Sonys and Toyotas and Hondas and so forth. But if you've noticed, these companies are starting to run into more trouble. You know, that more and more companies there are bankruptcies of these big companies, their markets are shrinking. Traditional, you know, internal combustion driven cars as a market are declining. And let's say electric cars are increasing. You need to be building your Teslas, if you will, if you're going to be relevant to the future. We pointed out to our Japanese colleagues that something like 11% of the world's large corporations are Japanese, and that all of those companies were once startups, meaning that Japan at one time was very good at producing startups. There's no way to escape this conclusion just looking at the data. Right now, they kind of suck at it. So the question is, how can you help a place that maybe has lost that mojo, maybe once had it, or maybe never had it, but can develop it? How do you move this along? And I think Julie and I and Christine all have the perspective that this tool, this innovation district tool, is one of your few tools to do that. How does that relate to equity and inclusion? One of the things that actually is nice about startups is that they tend to have more open doors than your typical large corporation that may be very established and is looking more at people with traditional credentials and so forth. With a startup, anyone can build a startup. There are many programs all over the world to provide capital to build startups. There are startup and entrepreneurship traditions in local communities all over the world, historical traditions of innovation, of entrepreneurship. And so you can tap into those things and you can create opportunities for more people to be building businesses across all tiers of society. And again, we think of innovation districts as places that can support and embrace that the way we have in the Venture Café community, with very extensive inclusion programming and a mission oriented towards doing that now for many years. So I don't know if that's helpful addressing some of those questions, but that's how we look at it.
That's great.
Any other views on? Yeah, please go ahead, Julie.
Some of these as well. So, you know, I think state and national governments globally, we've been starting to see a greater acknowledgement of this innovation district model. They're not necessarily codifying it with designations, but often they can say they often put it in a strategic plan saying, here's sort of one tool to realize. That's how some are doing it. And then others actually have identified specific areas, like, so that's in Amsterdam, they actually have a plan of innovation districts in a whole section. So every place is sort of looking at it differently. We're working with the National Economic Council in Israel. So we're going in at the national level, interestingly, and like working down this way rather than this way, which is completely different than I would ever imagine. But basically what we're seeing is that governments are sort of looking at it, you know, through different lenses and figuring out how they can harness this as an opportunity. So I just wanted to answer that piece. I'm wondering, you know, Tim, if you wanted to talk about, you'd be probably closer to this than I am, around the startup innovation funding piece. So there's recommendations on encouraging public funding and involvement in startup innovation communities, particularly during the pandemic.
Yeah, let me speak to that briefly. This is an area where we see actually huge disparity between one place and another in terms of the degree to which the public sector has committed to investments. A place that I might highlight that's committed heavily to such investment is St. Louis, Missouri. So St. Louis was at one time one of the strongest cities in the United States economically. It was the home to our aviation industry. It was the crossroads of a lot of the transportation in the United States. The train routes went through there. And many large companies like the Anheuser-Busch folks and so forth, McDonnell Douglas, have been headquartered there. But it went through a slow and long decline. Some of its older traditional businesses, you know, it went down, as all do, and it didn't replace them enough with new businesses. And they invested incredibly heavily, on the order of, I would say it's easily $100 million in creating something they call cortex, which is like the cerebral cortex, like in your brain. They took a section of St. Louis that was largely abandoned buildings and parking lots and things, but that it was really right in the middle between the newer part of the city and the older part of the city. It's right next to the medical school of the major university, WashU. And they really transformed it. They put in a new train station. They built new buildings. They drew in many large corporations, the Microsofts and Accentures of the world. They brought a CIC location there. They built large wet laboratories for new companies. And we saw St. Louis, the venture capital investment in St. Louis, just shoot up. In the first few years, I recall that it was on the order of a 3x increase in venture capital, just in just a short span of years. So some places do that. Rhode Island made similar investments. Other places don't really have that perspective, haven't wrapped their heads around it. And one of the things that we try to help them think about is that our public sector has traditionally invested in roads to get people from A to B. We invest in airports so that people can fly in and fly out. We invest in universities and schools. This is all what we think of as public infrastructure. And if you believe that innovation is where your future is going to come from, then investing in innovation infrastructure probably has a similar level of importance, or ought to have a similar level of importance. Cost-wise, the cost of some of these things is a tiny fraction. What people will spend on a new sports stadium is 10 or 50 times what it might cost to build an innovation district. And so as places think about this, and I know Rotterdam invested heavily in a sports stadium as an example, but they also invested in supporting innovation districts. And I think that's a smart public policy. You want to look at all of these kind of public infrastructure investments and ask yourselves, what are the ones that are going to have a long-term and important benefit for society?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because I see quite some more questions popping in on the chat. But one of the questions is also, what is the top 3 most important aspects of driving innovation districts and communities? And do you think that has changed after COVID?
So I'll give you my 3, but they're going to be radically different than what others will say. And it's just sort of where I sit probably. So leadership. So like the leadership of the key actors and saying, we want to do this, we want to get behind it. Number 2, believe it or not, is back on leadership. It's aligned leadership. So it's aligned leadership across different levels of either government and then at the local level. And then it's so important. I'm finding myself getting stuck and mired in places that just don't have any aligned leadership. And it's painful. And so you can take a great vision and you won't go anywhere with it. And then having the ability to take risks, to lean in together and say, let's do this together. Let's share resources. Let's put some money down for the down payment of the first space. Let's whatever. If you don't have that, then everyone just stops and they're stagnated. So that's my 3.
Christine, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, maybe not on that, but when you are talking, it's so really interesting for me. And I'm sitting here and I want to ask you about everything because
Please do. Let's keep it a round table.
yeah, because I think for us, we are in the very beginning because we have all those anchor institutions and researchers and students and everything. But we have only been doing and thinking about the innovation districts for around 1 year. So we are in the very beginning with the feasibility study and everything. So for us, it's so interesting to listen to you and actually to be aware of that it's okay that you're doing it differently. But the thing is for us, I think we need and we want to start with our strength. And as you said, Tim, probably that is a good idea. And to build on the strength and actually, but also be inspired of what you are doing in London, in Amsterdam, in Vancouver, and wherever. And for us, we really, I think we also need to attract. So maybe CIC, maybe you should come to Oslo and.
I'm looking for my invite.
I think it's interesting to build this connection and collaboration between the city as well. I think the level in the city is really important. As Julie said, the link to the local government, to the national government, it's so important for us. So we're working really, really good at that level.
So Christine.
But also collaboration with other cities. It's so inspiring for us.
Christine, I just moved my. So my son is a big Norway fan and speaks Norwegian. So he hung the flag on our wall. It's been living there for how long? So anytime, let us know. We'll come right over. Look, I think that I loved Julie's answer that innovation districts are about leadership. And so the key, actually, the whole key is you, Christine, in terms of how you're going to change your city. Oh, she's like, oh no. How you're going to change your city. And I think that goes for everyone on this call. It's that if you want to change your city, you want to change your country, it's about stepping forward and saying, okay, this is what we got to need to do. I do like your notion of looking at what other places have done, because I think there are great examples. Julie has done a really wonderful job, both in her previous role at Brookings and now really casting light on places that have done this well. It is at once hard and not hard, right? So the hard part, getting it really wonderful. Well, let me say it this way: one of the keys to success, because someone asked that key to success, is that your strongest innovators and entrepreneurs want to be there. There is a modest number of people who are your Meg Whitmans, your Steve Jobses, your people who built really large, successful companies. And every city you kind of know who they are. There's a dozen people around your city who really would win the, kind of most likely to succeed as an entrepreneur award, right? And you want to make sure that those dozen, like all of them, want to be in your district. And so the choices that you make when you build your district need to be built around that. If, for instance, there's some political pressure to put your district out in an empty area of town that nobody wants to be in, that's probably not where those people are going to want to go. And then if those people who are really your mentors and they're teaching everyone else, the power of a district is bringing people together so they learn from each other. But if your strongest innovators aren't there, it won't work, right? So then you can kind of work backwards. This goes a little bit to one of the questions in the chat about how you actually design these districts. The first thing is, how do you design the district so your strongest innovators physically want to be there? And it leads to something somewhat counterintuitive. The classic view, and I think Julie's seen this in like umpteen public engagements with governments about how to do this, is they think that if they pour public money into a place where nobody wants to go right now, they can get them to go there and maybe kind of build some innovation. Our view is that innovation districts are really about helping the whole country. You should be focused less on helping a small regional part of your country which is struggling, and more on, or your state or whatever it is, more on bringing up everyone. How are you going to get a Microsoft or an Apple or somebody like that to get going in that region? And when you have that perspective, that then drives the more micro decisions, like what kind of building are we going to build? What is the physical space like? But I can tell you right now, these dozen people in your city that have the potential to really build the next Microsoft, they have a lot of choices. They also can choose to move to a Boston or a San Francisco or a London. Yeah. And so you need to be building something that keeps them and makes them want to stay. In going back to the St. Louis example, an interesting kind of anecdote is that the company Square, the payments company, it's one of the most successful financial services startups in recent years, was founded by a couple of graduates from the Washington University of St. Louis. And they started the company in their dorm rooms. They moved to San Francisco and they made it very successful, which is kind of the classic but sad story for a place like St. Louis, right? But those guys came back and kind of visited their alma mater, and they saw the innovation district that had been built in St. Louis. And they said, oh my gosh, if this had been here when we were students, we would have stayed. And they put their money where their mouth was. They moved into the innovation district. They took a room for like 10 or 20 people, and then space for like 120 people. And then they built a whole building for Square back in St. Louis. They said, wow, the talent here is amazing. This is the place where we can grow our business. So I think you have to act the part to keep those sort of notionally dozen amazing entrepreneurial talented people to kind of stick around and grow in your community. Build your district, use your best minds in architecture and design to build your district so that those people want to be there. It actually matters. Are there no good restaurants? Well, get your best chefs to come and open a restaurant, right? Because if there are no good restaurants, who's going to go there? It's like, La Défense outside Paris. No offense if anyone's here is from Paris, but if you're a Parisian, the Parisians will tell you there are no restaurants in La Défense, which is this sort of growth area outside Paris where they have a lot of big buildings. You can't build an innovation district there until it's a place that people want to be. Once it is, then I would suspect that you might see real innovation happening there. Until then, that's more of a place where you put your claims processing department. And so I don't know if this is helpful in terms of people thinking about how you might build one in your district, but it's around these sorts of questions. And there's much more I could say, but I hope that's helpful.
I think it's exactly what we need to focus on in the feasibility study as well, because we have so many of those startups, facilities, and really good companies that have already, they are already there, but we don't have enough space actually at the moment so they can grow, and we can build that ecosystem in the innovation district as well. And we also need more urban qualities. Like I said, it's a kind of it's in the city, but it's a kind of a little bit sleepy part of the city. So we want to make it more vibrant, more interesting to visit and to come. And I want to make one more thing. We're also working a lot with the schools in the area, but also in Oslo. So we are using that as a tool to make this innovation district even more inclusive. So I don't know if that is a normal thing to do, but we think that's really, a good thing for us.
When you say inclusive, what are you doing, and what makes it inclusive for you?
We are working. We think it's important that. So we are in the very beginning. So we are starting this journey now, but we are working with the schools in the area. But we also want to work with the schools in the whole Oslo, to invite them to work with the research with the academia and the researchers. And we have a tradition for that in Oslo already, but we want to increase it and make it even better.
There's a question in the chat here about how you can do that. Like, how do you bring in the local neighborhoods and the local communities? Just one quick thought on that for those managing or running innovation districts. So in a large company, if you take, say, an intern into a startup, they're likely to be put into the accounting department and asked to do filing or something like that. In a 2 or 3 person startup, if you take an intern, this is a joke, but it's also kind of true. They'll say, okay, you're in high school, you can walk and talk. Okay, you're responsible for Asia. They give you enormous amounts of responsibility because they don't have enough time or people to do the things that they need to do. But I've seen this happen in the real life, where interns, even high school interns, are given enormous amount of responsibility and access in small startups, because there is 1,000 times more things to do than there is, time in the day, and it's better to try than not try. And so we built an internship program here in the city of Cambridge. It became, I think, after Harvard University, the largest intern program in the city. And we think that there are opportunities to do programs like that, where you're inviting kids. In our case, nearly all of those kids were people of color coming into that internship program. And we ran into challenges later in Cambridge because they were doing so well. There were more companies that wanted interns from the high school than there were interns available from the high school. So the companies were kind of competing to get these kids, which is just a fantastic situation. So looking for opportunities to open doors, particularly between the kids in the local neighborhoods and the companies in your innovation center, you'll often find that your public sector is willing to pay the wages and put in training programs. There are 2 programs we work with that actually prepare the kids by educating the kids on how to kind of work in a company setting, and sort of basic skills for working in a more of a corporate or business kind of environment. And so I would look at those kinds of possibilities. So
thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your perspective.
There's a lot of work that's being that's underway in a number of districts. Like, we just did this recent analysis on looking at what they're doing around inclusion. Tremendously varied. Some are just doing one thing, some are doing 50 things. And I think there's a lot of learning still to be done. And I think, Tim, what you just nailed was what a wonderful way of sort of driving new ways of inclusion. So I think it's really what we should be doing is sort of putting down and cataloging all the different ways and getting a sense of sort of the kinds of impact, short-term and long-term, and how it's linking to growth at the local level. So that's my sort of concluding thought, because I know we're wrapping up. So.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that, Julie. And Tim and Christina, of course, thank you so much for joining today. Yeah, looking at the time, we do have to wrap it up. I see more questions popping in the chat. But let's continue talking and networking if you can and if you're able to in a separate space. It's called a remote space. My colleague Daniel will be sharing the link in the chat right now. So we hope to continue our talks there with you, panel members, but also with the rest of the visitors. So again, thank you so much for joining today. And we look forward to seeing where the innovation districts are headed and see if your future plans become a reality.
Thank you very much, Laura. I will join the separate space for a little while. I have a couple of minutes. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, Tim. Great.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.